Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's stream of the Art Lounge Alley. I'm your host, and this is not where I left off yesterday. I'm actually starting a new page, but this new page is going to be filled with, you guessed it, more hand drawings. In fact, that's going to be for the rest of this week. I'm going to continue on with more hand drawings. What you're seeing here, though, and here, actually, this is like really old drawings. This is something probably, I don't know, 10 years ago, if not more. I figured it doesn't really matter. You know, I'm going to show you guys. Actually, it's kind of good, I think, to show you guys this stuff, just to see progress. You know, this is something to say, like, don't be discouraged by work that doesn't really turn out to be great, or, you know, isn't where you want to be exactly. But, you know, kind of getting something that I was talking about yesterday is just getting used to bad results, you know, rejections of your own ability, let's just say, or your own capability at the moment, getting used to it so that you can continue, as opposed to get stifled by it or become shackled by it and just, you know, kind of throw your hands up in the air and be like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this, and just giving up and not practicing, you know. So it could really go both ways. But I think if you keep in mind that I have to get used to bad results, I have to get used to rejection, that's going to help you, as I say, stay focused on improving. You know, not being shackled up by it, not looking at it and being like, it's not great. Just know that you have to put in more time, put in more effort, and overcome that obstacle. You know, just kind of look at it as like, you know, I guess a wall that's in front of you, and you want to kind of break through by just putting in all that time and effort for it. Here, I just have more examples of how to use the guide as a way to make sure that when you're drawing, everything is lined up. It's very, very important. I can't stress that enough, how important it is to make sure that features on a face line up properly. For example, this line right here that you see, it's really light. The line for the eyes ensures that they're perspectively correct, and also they are lined up next to each other, as opposed to having one eye that's higher than the other. In this case, it might seem that way because it's in perspective. This is a 3/4 view of the face. So the one eye is going to be like, if I was to draw, well, let's just use a ruler, for example. If I was to use a ruler, you would see, you know, the ruler itself is pretty straight, but the eye is higher. But notice how everything else follows that pattern. The mouth, you know, the direction of the mouth is following that. The nose, the direction of the nose, the curvature of the nose, they all follow that same sort of direction. So it doesn't look off. It looks right. But that line also ensures that, because let's say you have this 3/4 view, but the line isn't present, and you want to make sure that you draw the eyes according to the perspective. You might end up drawing the eye a little bit too low and the mouth a little bit too high or crooked towards this direction as opposed to this direction. So these lines ensure that, or just are a helping hand there to make sure that you do draw it in a proper perspective, in a proper place on the face. These lines right here just illustrate planes. This is something that I was talking about before, and I'll show you guys more on here. This would be considered a plane. This is also the front plane, the side plane, the back. So just kind of to explain, it's just sections that are somewhat flat, you know, that you could actually, I guess, put highlights on or shadows on, depending on how it curves. So as it curves to the side, and also depending on the light source, you're gonna have shadows here or highlights here. So it kind of helps. Having these planes helps you determine where shadows are gonna be, depending on the light source. So in this case, it would be the top left. Shadows, as you can see, are starting to form on the right. Just a quick note: shadows always form on the opposite side of the light source. So in this case, for example, since the light is coming from the top left, as you can see, there's shadow that's slightly forming right around here because there's the peak right about here. And because of this peak, and because the light source is traveling into this direction, hitting the peak, it's casting a small shadow towards the right side. Here, as you can see, it's a lot more dramatic because it's even further away from the light source. So yeah, anyways, but just going back to what I was talking about, planes, there are large planes basically. So the front would be the large plane, the side would be a large plane, and there's also smaller planes as well. So like, for example, this section right here, that's also a plane. And as you could see, the light source, how it affects it, there aren't much dips and crevices in this section right here. It's pretty flat. So it's going to, depending on the shadow, either be a shadow or be in the light. So another section for shading, as I mentioned, the forehead right here, that's a plane as well. The bridge of the nose, that's also a plane. This section of the nose is also a plane. The side of the nose is also a plane. So just sections that kind of eventually curve into creating a three dimensions. And that's what you kind of see in here as well on the bottom. These are all kind of divided. This line right here is to indicate like, okay, the front plane ends right about here and the side plane begins. So this section will be the side plane, as you see here. And also, as I mentioned, the forehead being another plane as well. I think there's another section that kind of demonstrates planes better. It's probably on the other side. No, there it is. Okay, so here is another perfect example of planes. So this is the plane for the forehead. Now this is another plane that's starting to form around the forehead. This is another plane right here. This is another one on the side. So visually, for you guys to just get a better understanding of what it means, it does come up a lot. So it's a good idea to just understand it visually and not just verbally. So this would be the larger plane, right? If you were to zoom out, let's just say this is like the forest as opposed to the tree bark. So this would be the large plane. This would be another large plane right here. And then if we're talking about tree bark, these are the detailed planes. This section right here, this section right here, the nose section. Also, you could see like this little triangular section on the nose itself. That's another plane. But notice how they're all distinct based on the position that they start to form. So this is kind of laying downwards. Now this plane is moving upwards, so it starts to change right about here. Then this plane is moving back to form that curve. So this is the section that it starts to do that. Then this section right here, again, it's forming back. So it breaks about here, and then it starts to form on top of it. So all these planes put together eventually create a three-dimensional object. That's the best that I could explain it at the moment. But just going back to this, it just shows that, it demonstrates it. And the more you draw it, the better you understand these ideas, these concepts. So it's a mix of that. It's just showing guides, these guidelines, how they go around if you were to look at it from profile view. And it's a little bit further away than your average profile view. But these lines just show how far it goes. So from the nose, this is a common anatomical feature. the bottom of the nose is right about where the earlobe is. So you can see how that goes from the bottom of the nose all the way to where the earlobe is. Then the eyebrow line, where the eyebrow is basically the end of the ear, the other tip of the ear. So this line right here is forming that, to let you know, and it goes all the way around to give you guys more of a three-dimensional visual aid. All right, so with that review and what you're checking out, I'm going to start with drawing more hands. So I'm going to do a quick gestural shape there. I'm going to use like the cylinder shape to form the bottom, the wrist area of the hand. And then from here, I'm kind of going to use like a square shape or a rectangular shape actually, just to quickly do a gesture drawing for like this section of the fingers. So I like to use a rectangle to do that. That's kind of what's going on over here. So pretty basic, right? Very simple shapes, nothing really complex here. And now I'm going to start building on top of them. I'm going to start forming the fingers more, giving them more definition. I'm still keeping it loose. I'm not really pressing too hard. And remember, those basic shapes were just placeholders. You don't have to follow the exact exterior line of them. They're just there because, for the most part, to make sure that the space that you did draw it in, everything fits, right? Like, so you selected, okay, I want it to be this big. So using those basic shapes, you kind of like set the parameters to make sure it's not too wide, not too long. But then from there, it becomes really your call. You know, you could change things around more. If something is a little bit too wide, you can just start tapering things off a bit. And for those of you who might find this to be way too much information, don't worry about it. The entire thing, it's here so that you could, if you grasp this concept or if you grasp these ideas, to give you a better understanding. But most importantly, no matter how I word it, is for you to practice. You can understand all this stuff just visually. You know, by doing this stuff over and over and over and over again, your eye just gets used to seeing things in proportion, in their right place. Let's just say, if you draw things in the right way, you know, you just visually kind of grasp all that stuff. So verbal is just I'm going to say a boost, a boost to your learning experience when it comes to this. But mainly you'll get better, not through just understanding it verbally, but practicing, having your hand actually follow these lines, create these lines, and visually for you to be more and more familiar of their placement. Ooh. So for those of you who missed it, yesterday was a special intro. I was celebrating the 300 subscribers from YouTube. I was really happy about that, so I presented a double feature of Steve Cutt's animation, and actually watched it again yesterday. Especially the second part, the second animation. It's just so well done. The animation, the cinematography, how he drew all those features, all those scenes. It was really good. But also I noticed a couple of things which I wanted to bring up actually. If you guys were to rewatch it, notice how most of the scenes, everything is in black and white except for products, except for just like this idea of consumerism. And there are also other really interesting things there. I think it was clever. It's a clever way of just kind of making people recognize how terrible all this stuff is, all this like mass production without even consideration to the environment or the ecosystem, in a way by flipping the script. Like what if it was people who were subjected to that sort of awful negligence, awful lack of consideration, but also just kind of reflecting like what is going on right now, the funny thing is that it's not just now. Like this has been going on for decades. It's the same fights, same arguments, but because of consumerism, because of this, and that's kind of like what Steve Cuts tends to include in both of the animations, the first and the second one. It's this idea of how like consumerism just makes people very complicit. It's like it's a way to and it even goes back to like another animation that I showed you guys called Happiness, which is more about like, it's presented again using animals, and this time it was rats as a way of saying like we're part of the rat race, but they were all just like going in, working, like buying a bunch of stuff, chasing happiness through products. And it's momentary, it's fleeting, and that's why you see like the mouse going from one thing to another, trying to find it with products, trying to find it in alcohol, trying to find it in whatever is being thrown in their line of vision, basically. And because of this consumerism, people are totally complicit, and they're just kind of like satisfied to a certain extent, just enough so that they won't want to actually do anything about all the exploitation, all the corruption, all the terrible stuff that you were seeing in that other animation. Turning Point, the one that I was showing you guys yesterday. It's just enough so that people will be like, I'm too comfortable. Like, I have all this stuff around I could go and buy. Or if they feel, unhappy about something, they just log on and shop for something that's going to make them feel happy. And then once they get it, they play with it, they throw it down, get the next thing. It's this kind of like feedback loop, right? It's like you feel uncomfortable, you buy something, you feel good, it loses its value, you get back to feeling uncomfortable. And it's just constantly going. It's almost like the drive for consumerism. So you could see how it's fed through society. Like, people are constantly irritated, whether it's by too much traffic, whether it's all this stuff that's going on politically, or whether it's like really toxic work environments. It's all feeding the system that wants you to keep consuming things. So the bigwigs, people have really thought about this. I mean, prior to the Industrial Revolution, how it came about was people just planning this out, understanding human psychology and playing on it, and now it's just this kind of thing that kind of feeds itself. Coupled with brainwashing media, and what it teaches people to interact, or how to interact with one another. The idea of competitiveness, the whole fascist value of superior, inferior, that also makes people really irritated. So they go and they buy something to prove themselves to be otherwise, or to make themselves feel better. Overeating, because that's also another pleasure box, where it's like, oh, if I don't feel good, then I'm going to go and I'm going to eat this thing and I'm going to feel better about it. And what do you eat? You eat junk food, which is another capitalistic tactic. So everywhere you're looking, the wrong answers are around. You got these advertisements that are thrown in your line of vision all the time, as you saw in like Happiness, where the mouse is buying a huge TV and then they see a car and they're like, oh, I want to get this car, and they get the car, but then they're stuck in traffic and they're irritated, so they go to alcohol and they drink one thing to another until they're just completely lost, and then they're like, oh, maybe drugs are going to help me. They go to drugs. So, rather than people banding together and being like, this is crazy, this is repulsive, like this system is just breeding sociopathic behavior, or it's breeding aggression and hate for one another because of this, because of all these things that are pushed on us, and we're not really getting good education here. They're not telling you like, hey, these are really toxic things, and this is what's really going on in the system. If this is what you're going to be dealing with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, not too many things are actually saying it. It's in fact the opposite. And that's what brings out complacency, is because it's just enough. It's just enough to have people not really push for anything different, any sort of change. And you can kind of see that in the animation, The Turning Point, where there's like a family of it was bears. It was bears, and there's a kid, they're just growing up, they're seeing these things for the very first time, and they're like, oh, this is awful. And they're seeing like humans being like tortured on TV, and the baby bear goes up to the parent and he's nudging him to like pay attention, like, hey, look what's going on. And the father bear, he's like sitting there, and this is another thing that I liked, his slippers were human faces, So it's kind of like similar to the idea of now, like where people are wearing animals as comfort. So he's sitting there with his human slippers on. He's reading a newspaper that says like 1% are getting richer. Corporate profits are going up, and he's just looking at that, and he's just like irritated by what he's seeing. So he just covers it up by like raising the newspaper higher over the TV to not pay attention to it. So it's just it's this thing. And another thing that really feeds that system, perpetuates all this disgusting stuff, is having people basically resort to supporting it and hating like anything that reminds them like, hey, you're supporting this, you're actually enabling it. So then people start to make excuses like, oh, well, it's time to grow up. It's basically saying it's time for you to be a sociopath now. You have to accept these things and be okay with them being escalated more and more, which eventually enables more fascism. And then there's people who are like, oh, well, I'm not a fascist. I'm not like a Nazi. I don't think Nazis are cool yet. The way they interact with one another, the way their values are, how they see things, the whole idea of like, oh, superior, inferior, and not being bothered to really change anything, or seeing whenever they see like activists or protests, they're just like, oh, these kids they need a job, like that sort of thing. It's just them trying to pacify this like guilt that they're feeling for perpetuating something that's terrible. There's during a time of the Nazi takeover, right? It wasn't like they just made all that in one day, overnight. It was years of people being complicit. It was years of people turning a blind eye to what was going on and not really taking any action, and just being like, meh, the same way as that bear is kind of raising the paper and just not even paying attention or cares to really do anything about it. And then next thing you know, people are thrown in concentration camps, and there's all this like sick, insane behavior that came from it. So of course, that's where the wall came up. That the Berlin Wall that divided people who were pro-Nazi behavior and there were people who weren't. And, but that was already after things started to really escalate and get worse. That was when things started to turn to like psychotic sort of environment. And then people were like, oh shit, we got to do something, we got to start. So now it's back to that again, where, they're trying to make you think, oh, it's time for you to grow up. Basically saying, stop paying attention because we're trying to create the same problems or recreate that scenario for profit, for, power or whatever. Now it's a new generation doing the same insane stuff because they've been conditioned by the old generation to do it. Has nothing to do with innate behavior. If your environment, your parents, the ones that you look up to are telling you that this is the way to go, and they promise you things like money and independence and opportunity and this, that, and the other, a lot of these kids end up going for it and they start supporting it. So some people think like, oh, well, I'm not a Nazi, I have a job or whatever. Well, you're kind of complicit. You're enabling all this stuff instead of banding with people who want to create change. Banding with people who want to make a difference and create a world where people don't act like sociopaths and don't enable more sociopaths and psychopaths. I think it's really interesting actually that nowadays people are watching like news or like posts, let's just say, because I don't think a lot of people are watching news anymore. but posts, let's say, about some news event, and they're like, oh, there's this person that committed this crime, and they broke in and stole this, or like they vandalized some business. These are criminals. These are terrible people. Or, they'll arrest somebody who was being violent. But then you got somebody, right, who is saying, go out and murder people for my name. So like what you're seeing in Russia, what you're seeing in a lot of other areas where people are going out and killing or, doing all sorts of awful things. Or like, for instance, the war in Russia. You got millions of people dying because some asshole decided to say go to war. And he's basically killing, bombing, destroying innocent lives. People who have nothing to do with whatever their political agenda is. They're just people going about their day. They're dying. And that's considered to be okay. Like, people aren't outraged about it enough to actually, demand that change. But when it comes to something else, like social media events or whatever, they're like, oh, this person's terrible. They're awful or whatever else. They're claiming or demanding the person to get arrested or want the person to get arrested. I don't see a difference here. I think that a person who is creating war crimes, and all the people who are committing them, are also psychopaths. There's no difference. They're murdering innocent people, like kids, in neighborhoods, bombing those places. That's what a psychopath would do. They would kill innocent people for the whatever power, for attention, to temporarily pacify their deranged God complex. What's the difference between a psycho like that and somebody who is creating these war crimes? Politicians who are demanding it. Like, they arrested Charles Manson back in the day because he was the mastermind behind Sharon Tate's death. And they're like, this person is he's just like a serial killer. He's like a psycho or whatever else. They arrested this guy and they put him in jail, as they should. He was a nut job. But you have somebody else who's doing something even worse. Not just one or two people that are being murdered. Hundreds and thousands of people who are innocent. And suddenly people are just like, well, I guess. It's the complacency. It's the complacency of a capitalist system. This consumerism. It's a psychological manipulation. They know, like, well, we just gotta give them like a Black Friday deal for them to buy a new TV, and they'll shut up. It's their pacifier. Let's just give them a pacifier. Oh, look at this new toy that came out. It has all these channels, or it has these like flashy buttons or filters. Check that out. Well, let's go murder more people for profit. They're paying attention to all these little toys we're dangling in front of them. Let's go and drill some oil and destroy more areas and establish our corporations here so that we could milk it for cheap labor. You see a lot of these businesses, like even quote unquote, let's just say Democrats, they're doing it too. They're outsourcing stuff. They're like, oh, if it costs like 50 cents for somebody out in Indonesia to like do this job, that's really going to cost someone here $30 an hour. I'm not gonna go for that. So they don't value their own people. They don't want their own people to even excel. So it's a totally corrupt system. Capitalism is absolutely parasitic. I mean, that's basically what all those animations were pointing at. And the only answer is what you saw in Iran. Like, it's something I mentioned before. They were protesting for months to a point where they abolished the morality police. Like, such a breeding ground for corruption there. It's ridiculous. That idea of morality police, like just people going around beating people based on their own idea of what morality is. No way is that going to be abused. Murder somebody over a piece of clothing. Insane. But yeah, they protest for months. And you saw like people were filling up the roads. It wasn't just like 20 or 30 or 40, 50 people or even 100. It was like 200, 300. I'm going to say thousands. I'm not even going to say in hundreds. I'm going to say it was thousands of people out on the street. And I'm sure they had to rotate. I'm sure they had to have like, Group A. Group A would, of like 1,000 people would go out on the street. They would protest. And then Group B would come in, take their spot so that Group A could go and rest and take care of stuff. And then there would be Group C that's also the same way. And they would just continuously rotate, occupying all those areas. To make sure that things aren't going to be business as usual, and they continue to demand something very specific. I see like, I'm browsing through things and I'm noticing people are holding up signs saying unfair labor practices. Like, what are you demanding there? That's just a sign that says I'm complaining, but it's not really saying anything. It's not demanding any sort of change specifically for them to enact. If you demand specifically on your signs, on your protest signs, you say abolish morality police. That's something for them to achieve. It's not vague. It's not some general concept. Demanding livable wages. That is specific. Like, what is the protest about? Wages, needing livable wages. 5 hours max, working only 5 hours instead of working 8 hours so that you could actually enjoy your day as opposed to stuff the pockets of corporations. Like, some people are so brainwashed to it that they'll even support it. They'll be like, I want to work 8 hours. Like, their existence is basically subservience to a corporation that wouldn't care if they dropped dead. Like, as we saw in the pandemic, they didn't even care to give people raises during that time. Like, they're devoting themselves to your company. And as you could see, it's not about that. That's just like a gaslighting tactic to make you work harder. We appreciate you. Now work harder. Make us more profits. Like, shut up and do it, basically. And people are like, yes, and in fact, I'm also going to defend you. I'm going to say that, people need to continue to serve your company. That's like Stockholm Syndrome. And a lot of them think they're really clever by defending it or coming up with clever ways of defending it. When in fact, they're just saying, this is how sick I am. This is how mentally brainwashed and how much I've been damaged by capitalism, where I'll defend my abusers. It's wild. And that's what I really love about Steve Cutt's work, is not only is it great artistic work, but the message is there. The message really puts itself out there, makes you think about all this stuff. I absolutely love it. That's great artistic work. I'm also seeing it on social media, and a lot of these posts coming from people who are dedicating themselves to fight for a better future, right? They're like, hey, look at what's going on right now. They're exploiting this, they're exploiting that. And people's response is to try and either boast about their knowledge and be like, oh, I know about this because this was happening, and I knew about this because that was happening. And, making clever comments where it's like, you're missing the point. They're telling you to do something about this. They're saying you're getting exploited. You're getting used. And this is how you guys need to band together and demand change. Your taxes are being used for their own entertainment while you're suffering. And people are just coming up with witty comments and basically just having ego trips with themselves and others around by recalling things that happened and so on and so forth, as opposed to being like, we need to really do something about this. We're being exploited. Are we gonna get another chance at this? It's like, there is no reset button, guys. There is gonna be, things are just gonna get worse. You're gonna get older, and then maybe that's it. So unless we do something about it, it's just gonna be a miserable, more and more miserable years going by as we get older. But yeah, it's interesting how other countries have caught on, and they're actually doing it. In fact, in China, one of the most oppressed countries as well, people are protesting, and they're just like, nope, we want better conditions. Meanwhile here, it's like more and more Nazis are surfacing right in front of people's eyes. It's not even just this subtle thing. It's emerging everywhere, and people are just like, well, back in 1970, this was going on. And it's like, yeah, what are we planning to do about it exactly? Where are the protests against this? Where are the protests demanding accountability from politicians? There's nothing else that could be done, because there's so much corruption within the government. Anything that people do is going to go through a system that's full of corrupt people. So like this petition thing that people are doing, they're like, oh, sign a petition. You wouldn't believe how many petitions are being thrown in, and none of them are considered. It's like years and years, because the system is corrupt, because there's so much favoritism there. And people exploiting loopholes, and then politicians being bought out. So for the people who are supposed to make decisions, they're being bought out to ignore certain things, overlook stuff or whatever else. So there's different ways that they avoid responsibility, they avoid change or action or any of it. They look for as many ways as possible. Because a lot of it is people against corporations. So like corporations are like, look, we need to keep exploiting people. We need you to avoid this. We'll pay you this much, because corporations are racking in billions of dollars, and they're sending that money to politicians to make sure that politicians do what they want. So when people are demanding change, those corporations are like, here's a bunch of money, shut down any, like what you saw with the railroad strikes. Like they're like, shut down any railroad strikes, here's a bunch of money. And that's basically what Republicans are. They're just like puppets for corporations. The corporations are stuffing their pockets with money, and they're also getting money from our taxes. So just crazy amount. So to think that without these protests, without people's action, that there's going to be some sort of change, huge disappointment there. That's fooling yourself. And the fact that people haven't already really screamed like, hey, enough is enough, like this is it, we want our life, we want to be able to enjoy it, we want to be able to work in an environment that appreciates our skill and time and effort. Time for you guys to get out. Like we're going to shut down the economy, or we're going to shut down your companies. You guys didn't even care about us when we were basically dying off to this killer virus. Like no raises, no time off, no like sick leave or anything. Not living in a free world, or not living in a democratic society. It's very much a fascist, corporate fascist society under the guise of free speech and democracy and opportunity and all that other stuff. There's like a bunch of networks that just keep feeding that bullshit to people to make them think that that's actually what's going on. And I think more and more people need to ask themselves, like, hey, am I one of those people who stood aside and let Nazis take over and build concentration camps? Like, am I a complacent person who didn't care to do anything? Does that make me a Nazi? Wow. I can't believe I actually ranted through all that. I really do believe these are really important things. I think about it very often. I hope you guys do too, because this is all of our future. And it's also just how society views itself and how people interact with one another. I think it becomes more and more toxic the less and less people care for collective action. It just becomes this like everybody for themselves, while fascists and corporations band together and make things even more miserable. So playing into exactly what they want, which is having you die off while stuffing their pockets. And as you could see, a lot of people, from Steve Cutts to a lot of these painters as well, and what they're portraying, recognize that it's a huge problem. All right, everybody, with that said, I'm gonna end the stream for tonight for figure drawing basics. I'm gonna take a 5-minute break, and I'm gonna be back for the project stream, which is gonna be painting. We're gonna be doing more painting on a project that I put aside for some time, and now I'm picking it up again. It's gonna be some oil painting. I'm gonna be doing a study of Jacques-Louis David, Death of Socrates, another philosophical figure from history. So tune in 5 minutes to check out what it is. And remember, if you guys enjoy this content, if you want to help support the stream, just remember to hit the like and subscribe button. They're both really appreciated by me. And I'll see you guys in the next stream.